Welcome to the Coalesce podcast. My name's Grant.
I'm Meg.
And today we have, for episode 20, the privilege of having Andrew Scott with us. Andrew is one of the main guys that does the Coalesce stuff on the back end and is responsible for much of the TypeScript work, all of the beat stuff, and many of the kind of really deep details of how Coalesce works. So we have some questions for him. We want to talk a little bit about the history and kind of how it got started. Initially, just to give you a little bit quick background, it got started. We had a project for Vanessa B. Ann Crisis Nursery, which is a crisis nursery here in Spokane that gives kids a safe place to go when they're in a tough situation potentially. And so they had a form. Their intake form actually had potentially a couple of hundred different fields that we had to fill out, and it was a fairly long process. We didn't want to lose things. We wanted to have things like automatic saving. We wanted to have really nice drop-down lists and all that. And writing all that by hand just seemed way too daunting. And so at that point in time, I wasn't working with Andrew, but we started I started building a framework to do this and had some code generation, things like that. Kind of the basic ideas were there. And the idea was to say, hey, it's really fun to build out database models and classes and business logic. And it's really fun to build UIs and do all the stuff for that. But doing all the things in the middle and like creating a searchable, pageable list that I can then bind into a select box. Those just, if I have to do one of them's fine, but having to do 30 of them on a page just isn't that good a time. So anyway, that was how Coalesce initially was done. It was actually built on Knockout at the very beginning, because that was really kind of the framework of choice at that point in time. Angular and React were kind of just coming into their own, not really well accepted at that point. But so we started that, built some apps using it. And then Andrew came along, and Andrew and I Andrew started working. I think Andrew, was it first Vanessa B. Ann? Were you working on that first, or was there another project that you started?
We had a few different projects, I think, that kind of started up on right around the time that I started on the Vanessa B. Ann software. This is all around probably late 2016.
Okay.
So there was kind of a few that I was on simultaneously.
And so then we went down to visit one of our customers down in Boise. And I remember Andrew and I can still see the little booth we were sitting in down there at the hotel. And we sat down there one night and we said, hey, we know we can do better. And so we figured out some ways to start solving problems. And that's where I think the whole behaviors thing came from, where data sources was around that conversation. You said, hey, I think I have a way we can solve this. And then we started moving it over to TypeScript. And then a little bit later, we decided, well, hey, we really need to get off Knockout, because that's not what all the cool kids are using. And really trying to find a spiritual successor to Knockout, and something that really supported the kind of model that we used. And so can you talk a little bit about like why we chose Vue and maybe didn't choose React and Angular?
Yeah, so Vue really is kind of a spiritual successor to Knockout, and to the extent that like Knockout and Knockout's observables and computed objects, Vue also has the same concepts in it. It has real reactivity, unlike React, which up until recently
ironically didn't have reactivity. This
isn't actually reactive as Angular. So, a framework that is capable of watching when certain data properties change without adding a whole lot of orchestration out of event handlers and callbacks and things like that. So now Vue was really kind of a natural fit. To succeed Angular is kind of the next underpinning for Coalesce.
Yeah, and I think it's really served us pretty well. And we have actually gone back and kind of looked and say, hey, does it make sense with Angular, maybe React? And maybe now that they have some of those things, it could make sense. Now, if I did want to use it with another framework, I don't know that we recommend this, but it is built into layers. Can you kind of describe some of the layers as we kind of look at that, especially that client side? Because we did very intentionally go in and try to build some of that stuff up so that even if you wanted to just use part of it, you could.
Yeah, so really the client side of Coalesce's generated code is split into 4 layers. So at the bottom, we have the metadata, which is just pure JavaScript objects that just kind of describe the shape and structure of the objects that make up your Coalesce project's data model. So just plain old JavaScript objects with things like, hey, here's a property on this object. It has this name. It's a foreign key. This foreign key references this type over here with this navigation property. All of that kind of stuff. So it really is just pure your JavaScript objects could really be used any way that you like. It does have, it technically has dependencies on the Coalesce view library, which provides some of the types, the TypeScript types that help define that.
Mhm.
The next layer up are the models, which are largely just plain TypeScript interfaces without actually any implementation. There are classes for each one so that you can kind of interact with them like a class, so you can instantiate model. But really, they're just interfaces that describe the shape of your model objects in TypeScript, but in a very, very plain way, no bells and whistles, anything about them. The third layer are the API clients, which are really just kind of wrappers around Axios, which in turn is a wrapper around Fetch for any modern browser. And those just provide nice ways to interact with actually calling the APIs and returning hydrogen instances of the model layer. And then finally, you have view models, which is where all the bells and whistles that you have been seeing in past, all the past episodes.
So things like autosave and all that kind of stuff.
Autosave and dirty state and the API state for all the different endpoints on a model, all the logic for loading, updating, pretty much everything is in there that you really kind of use on a day-to-day basis of the project.
Cool, that's great. And then I think we kind of looked at a few of those, but that's really nice to know, especially if you're looking to use something like an Angular or React. You can kind of use those, even the bottom 3 layers potentially, and just not use, because really, as far as the view tie-ins, where do those really start?
The view tie-ins really start at the model layer. You're not going to be able to use these with anything other than.
Okay, because they're reactive properties and things like that. Is that the
right? They're not significant view tie-ins at the model layer, but we do some things
so
just kind of make it nicer to use. For example, the data source instance classes. That's model layer. We always when those are instantiated, make them reactive.
Sure, right.
We don't forget to do that.
Right.
Actually, that's an upcoming change in V5, but.
And looking at kind of the history around Coalesce and the changes you did do, it used to be on V2. It's now on V3. Maybe it'd be interesting to look at some of the big feature changes that have happened since when you just started off with your data sources and behaviors to now, and kind of the choices around why some of those feature changes happened.
Yeah. So, if we look way back, and before we even had the notion of data sources and behaviors, really all the customization points in Coalesce existed as either partial methods or override methods on the API controllers, which worked to some extent, but it was really pretty limiting, and there weren't a lot of extension points if you wanted to override maybe the way that the sorting is done for a particular type. You could do that with the attributes for default order by attribute. But if you needed anything more complicated than what you could represent with attributes, there was no option for doing that.
Yeah, because attributes kind of get crazy after a while. You can only put so many of them on, and then with parameters and all that, it gets so you really don't know what's going on really well. It's hard to put a box around that.
So, really, if you look back, most of the major changes that we've made to Coalesce are just things that we've learned through experience and building things with the application of like, hey, we can probably do this in a better way that it's more accessible, it's more customizable, and maybe even a little bit easier to do those extension and customization.
What has been one of your favorite changes to Coalesce?
Probably just the move to view. Having a proper, component. I mean, okay, Knockout had component.
barely had components.
You didn't have you had no ability to have TypeScript or IntelliSense in your HTML templates with Knockout. You get all that with the modern view tooling. There was, no support for that whatsoever on any platform with Knockout. Building stuff with knockouts, but just a little bit more tedious, and the extent to which you had to use individual observables everywhere. With you can just have entire reactive object,
Right.
entire reactive object trees, where you can kind of, to an extent, just forget about reactivity. And it all just kind of happens for you.
Yeah, I do think it's kind of funny that we have come back to this kind of ref idea and either like the dot value. And if you're familiar with Knockout, it didn't use that exact thing, but you always had this kind of wrapping and unwrapping concept that would happen inside of Knockout. And now we have that a little bit in some of these other, maybe everything's just converging on Knockout.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does feel that way. Now you have signals, the concept of signals and React and Angular both. And now you're even having, proposals to bring signals in as a baseline feature in JavaScript, which is interesting how that's playing out if you like to read RFPs as your time.
So when you look at kind of where things have gone, any hint on kind of some things? It's feeling more like, because we're using this internally here at Intelitech to build lots of projects every day, and we're essentially adding features that need to be added based on the projects that we're doing. And we've just found that the rate of adding features has really slowed down recently because it's starting to feel fairly feature complete. And what are you thinking are some of the things that are coming in the short term, at least 2024, 2025?
Yeah, a lot of the things we're doing is just kind of cleaning up the rough edges at this point, deprecating or removing some of the things that we've since, come up with better ways to do. We have fully removed in version 5, we've fully removed the knockout stack. At this point, if you just still have projects on knockout, you could stick with the older versions, but it has such a low amount of usage at this point that it's not worth continuing to try to maintain that when it's really not being used. We are looking to kind of stop doing anything other than necessary maintenance on the Vue 2 stack. Vue 2 has been end of life for over a year now. Is that right? Year and a half?
Yeah.
Wow.
So if you do still projects on Vue 2, we're going to continue to kind of maintain that and keep it working, but maybe not adding any new features there at this point, because it really is time to upgrade to Vue 3. In terms of maybe more interesting stuff that isn't just deleting code, which is my favorite type of thing to do to code, is to delete it. It's really just kind of those smaller kind of developer experience enhancements. One of the things I worked on just a week ago or so was adding even stronger typings to the C-select component for its kind of lesser used properties and event handlers that you're writing directly to the key value or object value. Those are now strongly typed now, which is an interesting feat in its own, because you have to actually, you're passing in the type as the string through the for prop, and now you have to actually get that back out as the real actual type. So we now generate some kind of type lookup objects as part of the generated code to be able to drive that, to be able to map from a string type name to the real actual type.
Which, coming from C# land, I mean, that's hard to even imagine. But the cool things you can do with TypeScript are pretty darn amazing when it comes to that kind of stuff.
TypeScript is definitely great in your ability to kind of really do whatever you want and do some pretty powerful things. Just being able to look things up, even for a particular type, we can actually figure out what the TypeScript type of its key, of what its primary key is, using nothing but conditionally mapped types in TypeScript just by following through the metadata.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you want to talk just a little bit about metadata? I don't think we've even discussed the metadata piece yet.
Yeah, so I mean, the metadata is really what you see is what you get in the generated file. If you look in the metadata,
I want to pull that up, Meg. We can just pull up a generated metadata file so folks can kind of get an idea for what that looks like.
And we did kind of cover this a little bit when we were talking about the enums.
Yes, but it was pretty brief. I mean, we just kind of glancing at it for a second.
So I'll pull it up. Just give me a second here, but keep
Keep
talking
talking,
while I do that.
Yeah. So, in the knockout days, we would build all of our pages with .NET Razor files, CSHTML files. And so in that context, we had access to all of anything you can get out of reflection, which includes essentially the entire data model that is used for Coalesce's code generation. A dual stack nature to that, so you can get that exact same metadata through either reflection or through Losslyn, which may be a whole other conversation on some. In a Vue app, which is kind of statically compiled into JavaScript files, and you don't have, your code's not running on the server, it's running all of the client. You don't have access to the entire reflection data model of your application at runtime. So we really have to replicate all of the information that we need to be able to dynamically create controls and admin pages and all the other things that Coalesce has. We need this level of data to be able to do that.
So it's effectively what .NET would provide via reflection. We are now essentially giving that in a file to the front end inside Vue so that you can look up similar data.
Yeah. So, you'll see in here you have, for each type, you'll have the methods on the type, things like, hey, what's the controller route? If I need to call the API for this type, where does it live? Which is usually the same as the type's name, but might not necessarily be. Again, all the metadata for any custom methods, what are the parameters, what's the return type, any properties that have validation rules, those end up on here. Yeah.
Cool. So just go look at these things. You can fully just pull them out, import them like any other class, or these are just they're essentially data structures that'll show you all that information. So before we kind of wrap up here, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on here, but if somebody finds an issue, what should they do?
Yeah, come on over to the Coalesce GitHub project, github.com/deltex/Coalesce, and just log an issue and start a conversation about it, or just let us know if you found a bug or have a feature request.
Yep, we're watching that on a daily basis. So the team's looking at that and get somebody on. Now, this is a tricky project to actually contribute to because there's a lot going on at a pretty deep level. And one of the things we really strive for are abstractions that aren't leaky. But what that means sometimes is that you actually have to have pretty complicated things. There's a lot of complicated TypeScript going on behind the scenes. And we would, if you feel like, hey, I want to do some contributing to this, feel free. I encourage you to log an issue first, have some discussion with the team, with Andrew, myself, Meg, and some others about maybe the implementation of that. And hey, maybe that's something you want to bite off and put in a PR or something like that. So anyway, we're happy to have contributions and love having discussion about even like new features, if there are things that it should do. We're trying to draw some boundaries around this so that it doesn't just grow, so it eventually sends email and does AI and all the other things, but really trying to keep it in its inappropriate lane for building kind of form-based web apps and even some non-forms based web apps, but making that process like a lot easier for everybody. So Meg, any final questions, or Andrew, any comments?
No, I don't think so. If anybody has any questions, just leave a comment about it.
We'll have Andrew back on here sometime. So, Andrew, anything? Final words?
No.
Okay. Well, great. Hey, thanks everybody, and keep on building awesome Coalesce apps.